I think what being boxed in did was it made me frightened. And what it did was in the time that you ought to have the space to develop this sense of trust in yourself, this kind of like internal locus of evaluation, that time was spent doubting and feeling, why do I feel different than other people? I don't have the words to describe any of my experiences that are fundamental to who I am.
Welcome to Normalizing Non-Monogamy, the podcast where we interview incredible people from all over the world to hear their personal journeys of self-discovery through the lenses of love, sex, and relationships.
Our mission is to show people that they're not alone and to inspire them to embrace their true selves so that together we can open minds and live authentically without shame.
We believe everyone's story is powerful and beautiful, yet it's important to remember that everyone does life a little bit differently and that the views and opinions expressed by our guests do not necessarily reflect our own.
Additionally, we aren't doctors. Please consult a medical professional for anything regarding your health that you might learn about on the show. Enjoy!
Well, welcome to episode 352. We're Finn and Emma. I'm still struggling with a little bit of laryngitis, but it's getting better.
We waited as long as we possibly could, and you're still...
I know. It's been not fun. But anyway.
But it has been quiet around the apartment.
True.
Other than all the complaining about feeling sick.
Anyway, back to this week's interview. Today we have a wonderful conversation with Jen. Jen is a therapist originally from Ireland, but currently living in Scotland. They identify as a queer, pansexual, non-binary relationship anarchist, and they have been living with their partner of about 12 years.
But when they got together, they were monogamous.
They were.
And then throughout life, throughout university and afterwards, Jen started digging into themselves and doing a lot of deconstructing of self. Winds up with an amazing therapist who digs in, and then they decide to become a therapist themselves, which is even more digging and excavating to bring them to where they are today, to everything Emma just mentioned a few minutes ago. So super excited about this conversation and the way that Jen takes us through this whole process that they've been on for the last over a decade of figuring out who they are and how they fit in and what they want life to be like.
Yeah, it's an amazing conversation, and I feel like we could talk on and on about it up front, but I feel
maybe we let Jen talk about it?
Yeah,
maybe I let Jen talk about it? How about
we just jump in?
Yeah, so first thing you need to know is please head over to Jen's website. You can find links in the podcast show notes, either down below or on our website at normalizingnonmonogamy.com, where you'll find all of Jen's work and photos of Jen and our other guests from previous weeks. But please go check that out. Again, Jen is doing amazing work, as you will hear.
And I just want to jump in and say thank you again, Jen, for coming on, sharing your story, and for all of the incredible work that you do as well. We really appreciated this conversation and are excited to get it out there.
Without a doubt. And with that, we are going to jump right into the conversation for anybody who is a premium subscriber. And for the rest of you, just a couple of amazing announcements really quick. Here we go.
If you're not familiar with a premium subscription, it's a way to skip these announcements up front, but still get important dates in the outro. To sign up, go to our website, normalizingnonmonogamy.com. Scroll down on the homepage and you can sign up right there.
And while you're on our homepage, you should scroll right back up to the top and click on the community tab, where you will learn about our virtual community, which you hear us talking about all the time. However, there's something really, really exciting coming up. One of those dates Emma mentioned a minute ago.
September 13th to the 15th, 2024.
Yes, mid-September, about 6 weeks from today, if you're listening to this on the day it came out. Yeah, we're hosting a community retreat, an in-person community retreat for anybody who is a part of our virtual community. We're gathering in the San Francisco Bay Area for a weekend of amazing activities, workshops, and just hanging out and getting to know one another better.
Yes.
I got my words all mixed up. So yes, we would love to have you come join us. You can find out more information again on our website, normalizingnonmonogamy.com, under the community tab. And you'd get to be a part of not just our in-person retreat, but also part of the virtual community, where you're going to get daily, ongoing, 24/7 pretty much support for yourself and a community of amazing, like-minded people. Please check it out. We'd love to have you join us.
Again, you can find all of that over at our website, normalizingnonmonogamy.com, on the community tab.
Sorry, we told you that 4 times.
Did we?
Yeah.
I might have blanked out a little
That's
bit.
all right. You got laryngitis.
While you're there, go and also check out the resources tab because you can use the links there for stdcheck.com. It is our favorite way to get tested for STIs. Also, using those links supports the podcast and our show. So thank you so much. And you get to know your sexual health status, which is amazing and super important.
And you save $10 while you do it.
Yes, that part too.
Yeah. Nailed it. All right, let's jump into the interview with Jen. And just a final quick reminder, you can reach out to us, send us an email, send us a voicemail. We would love to have you come on the podcast and share your story. You don't have to be an amazing therapist from Ireland/Scotland. You can just be yourself, and we would love to talk to you. So please reach out to us, and we would make it happen.
And now let's go and talk with Jen. Welcome to the podcast, Jen. We are so excited to talk with you today and so grateful that you're here. Thank you for reaching out and coming on.
Yeah, it's so lovely to meet you both, finally.
Yeah, we have a bit of an imbalanced partnership here. You've listened to us many, many times, and we are just now getting to talk to you. So take it easy on us today, please. Yeah, we'd love to even the score a bit. Do you mind introducing yourself for us and for anybody out there in podcast land listening?
Yeah, so I'm sure we'll get into it. So the brief summary intro overview is my name is Jen Goff. I'm a person-centered experiential psychotherapist from the Republic of Ireland, but I'm based in Glasgow in Scotland. So I work with anyone looking for person-centered and social justice-informed therapy, but my practice is largely with queer, non-monogamous and kinky or kink practicing folk. Myself, I identify as queer, pansexual, and non-binary, so my pronouns are they, she. And I also identify as a relationship anarchist, which is, why I guess we're here today.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to dig into all of the things. And first up, just thank you for the work you do. Mm-hmm. It's amazing work and it's powerful work. So
yes,
glad to have you on and share a bit of your story and a bit of your work.
We would love for you to kind of maybe start today. What does your relationship ecosystem look like today? And then we'll dive back in time. You mentioned relationship anarchy, and I'm curious if you could dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess the way my relationship structure is right now is that I live with my partner of almost 12 years. So we've been together back in the day from when we were monogamous to now. I also have two life partners, one who lives in Glasgow, one who lives in Ireland. And I also have a gorgeous community, a growing community of people who I adventure and play with, in addition to all those lovely people that were already part of my relationship ecosystem. So yeah, lots of different relationships, different formats, different flavors, but just all unique in their own special way.
Yeah. Well, then let's go back in time. It sounds like sometime in the last 12 years, non-monogamy came into your world and your partner's world. And I'd love to maybe hear how that happened. And was there any sort of framework for this in your life before you sort of opened up in the last, 10 years or so?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So as I said to you, I'm from the Republic of Ireland. So very much I'm an atheist myself, but I'm culturally Catholic. I've grown up surrounded by a very cis het mononormative culture. There was really there was no space for anything that deviated from what I was seeing around me. So I went to a very religious education in school. Again, there was not really any other option. Like that was just the standard. And I think my awareness of non-monogamy was very much, and I say my awareness of non-monogamy, but I would actually broaden it out to my awareness of gender diversity, of all the beautiful ways we can express our sexuality, was all limited by the society that I was growing up in. And I think the interesting thing is that my actual immediate family was always very open. My parents were always very open, very, very non-judgmental. So it really represented the limitations of the wider culture and community that you're in, more than necessarily a sense of judgment from my immediate family, that I just never came across anything different. It just, in terms of contact theory, just wasn't a thing. Like, you know, you might see a threesome portrayed on TV, or, you know, all the absolute classics. Or, yeah. So, or, you know, on like non-consensual, non-monogamy, that being the only framework for it. So I just had no exposure to it until I got to university, when I was I went to university when I was 17, and this was still in Ireland. It was before I moved to Scotland. And I remember at that point I was doing, you know, I was studying social sciences around a lot of left-leaning people. And I was starting to kind of come to grips with my own sexuality at that point. Nowhere near getting to gender identity or relational identity at that point. But I remember that I became aware of polyamorous people. And that sounds almost like strange to say now, but it was like, oh, people are polyamorous and they do it. And I think at that point, looking back, I still couldn't I couldn't see that through a non-monogamous lens. I was still looking at it through a very mononormative lens, where I was like, okay, well, people are polyamorous, but are they, you know, is there maybe an attachment issue, or again, all the kind of classic stigmatizing beliefs, but I just had no contact with anything different. Like, I just could never have known that my own beliefs were so harmful and kind of reinforcing these stereotypes and falsities.
Right. Like the only way that could be a thing is if it were some type of aberration. Something was wrong. So they had to seek out something from the norm. Sounds
yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it just, it kind of passed me by. And I guess it wasn't until, so I moved to Scotland then, just 13 years ago, moved over to Glasgow. And that kind of started this, you know, couple of years of deconstructing my sexuality and eventually my gender identity. And I think I started going to counselling myself. I went to therapy myself. People call it counselling or therapy in the UK. So
that's fine. Both are used here.
Yeah.
Some.
Yeah, both. Yeah, I wasn't sure. Yeah, so I went to therapy myself, personal therapy, and that was when everything changed. So it was a person-centered therapist, and I think I had been for so long effectively buried underneath all these expectations and norms, that there were so many parts of myself that I never knew. Like I had no way of connecting with. And and a person-centered therapist was like the first time I felt able to both experience my real congruent self, like actually look at who am I, what do I want, how do I identify, but also like explore some of those things that fear had stopped me from exploring beforehand. So I guess fast forward, I'd always wanted to be a therapist, but I just never had the confidence to do it. And after going to loads of therapy myself, I was like, okay, I'm gonna go on this journey of becoming a therapist. And the training for a person-centered therapist requires, so I'm trained just in that approach, and that requires a level of self-reflection and excavation of your inner self that anything I hadn't uncovered in my personal therapy, I was absolutely going to uncover in the actual training. So I trained in this other city, and I remember part of that being this sense of curiosity. I started to think about what relationships meant to me, and this sense of obligatory relationships versus the relationships that you choose to be in. And this idea that a title on a relationship, like a bio-legal title on a relationship, would give that mean it deserves kind of more of my energy and my time and my commitment, versus a relationship that doesn't have a bio-legal status, but has a level of reciprocity and care and meaning and connection. I just deconstructed that in this way that was like, this just doesn't align with who I am. Like, I've now come to like really connect with my queerness, really connect with my sense of non-binariness. And I was like, it almost felt like the next step was like, okay, what do relationships mean? It felt like a queering of being a person in relation to other people.
Mm-hmm.
So I started researching different relationship styles and identities, and I came across the relationship anarchy smorgasbord, which was like, I just remember looking at it and being like, this is exactly what I've been trying to get to in therapy in terms of my own deconstruction, but I haven't been able to articulate because it's so, like, as you know, you've seen the smorgasbord, like, there's just so many needs that a relationship can fulfill and that we can fulfill for each other. And so I go into info mode. I'm like, I'm going to learn everything I can about this whole area. And I came across your podcast. And so that's why I guess this is a really special experience, is because I had learned as much as I could academically, not as much as I could, but I learned a lot academically. I was reading and I was taking information in. But the place that I was training to be a therapist was 2.5 hours away from here. And I would travel up every week. And every single week, I would just listen to the podcasts, your podcast from the beginning, different people's experiences. But because I was listening to it and then going into an experiential training course as a therapist, I was then also processing what that meant to me. And often, not always, obviously, there's other things that come up being a human being.
Yeah,
But I had this unbelievable space to go to now, I say unbelievable space. It was extremely cis-het mononormative space, but it was characterized by a willingness to be non-judgmental. So I was able to at least get out of that space what I needed for myself to start processing my own experience of non-monogamy.
Yeah.
And yeah, listening to you, I just listened to so many people saying their stories. And I remember listening to one particular podcast, episode, and I can't remember which one it was. But I remember somebody was talking about, I mean, this has come up multiple times, but I remember somebody talking about having this sense of community where you're like going for barbecues with your pals and you're like having these adventures together and just thinking like, that sounds like what life should be about, or I would like life to be about. But I also, at that point, I couldn't ever imagine. I was like, I just can't, I kind of thought, well, a lot of the people who are on the podcast are from America. There's of course going to be a massive community there. And often I think for things like this, you can just find spaces in the US that are maybe more progressive. The UK is certainly like fairly, a little bit slower to catch up with some things. And I just remember thinking, wow, I can't even imagine having a life like that where you're feeling so, because I think what stood out to me was everyone felt so connected and they were so intentional in their relationships. So yeah, I guess that's how it transitioned, I guess, from this deconstruction of myself as a person to then hearing the ways other people express themselves as non-monogamous people. And then also getting excited about what it could be and how connected it could be and how, I guess hearing people's experiences made it feel possible when most of the people I was interacting with, other than a couple of my queer friends who, had different kind of relationship structures, but for the most part, I was surrounded by monogamous people who weren't questioning their relational identity.
Right.
So yeah, that is, I guess that's the story of deconstruction to some extent.
Yeah.
Wow. It's beautiful though that like you were able to go on this journey that you do your own work first and then be like, okay, I really want to be a therapist. I'm intimidated by this, but I feel like I've done enough work myself that I'm going to go and do this training. And you did it and you dove in, and that's of course deconstructing even more. As someone who's currently in some of that training myself, I understand like it is a lot of personal work. And then you had these relational norms and everything, like you said, just coming at you of like, I can rethink this. I can redo this. I can work through this. And I think that's a really beautiful journey. I would love, just for some context, about how long was that journey?
So I think it about maybe, what year we're in 2024 now? So I guess just coming up on 4 years. I think that it required personal therapy. I think that was
Yeah.
for me was the first step. So I think that's I almost include it in my deconstruction of self in general, because I think it's just part of that. It's not like we just we're non-monogamous or relationship anarchists in this one little bit of our lives. It's who I am as a person. So I think, really about 4.5 coming up on 5 years.
Yeah.
So not long, I suppose, in the scheme of things.
Yes. And it's not long in the scheme of things. And it's also not 2 weeks, like it's also like it's a chunk of time where you've been doing this work to get to where you're at as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious back, like it's sort of a two-part question, but the first part is, growing up, you talked about how you had a very open family. And so it sounds like you didn't really feel boxed in or stifled there, but you grew up in a broader culture and the norms were very like, this is your box. And I'm curious, back then when you were growing up, did you feel boxed in, or did that feel like you were having to shut down part of yourself? And then was there a point where maybe it did start to feel like, okay, these other relationship styles exist. Not only do they exist, but I think maybe that might be me.
That's a great question, because I think what being boxed in did was it made me frightened. And what it did was in the time that you ought to have the space to develop this sense of trust in yourself, this kind of like internal locus of evaluation, that time was spent doubting and feeling, why do I feel different than other people? I don't have the words to describe any of my experiences that are fundamental to who I am. And that that feeling of, where do I belong? I feel separate from it. And I remember trying to figure out why I didn't feel like other people about a lot of things. So religion being one of the biggest things, like, again, my parents didn't force religion down, on me and my siblings, but it didn't mean that we still had to participate in it. I had to participate in religion in school, for example. And I think I spent so much time trying to challenge that and trying to make sense of why I couldn't just get along with things like everyone else seemed to be able to do, that I just never had a chance to develop a sense of self. So I think, it wasn't until my late 20s that I really feel that I then had the space to figure out who I was. And I think that's in part because when I think moving to Scotland was a huge part of it. Moving to Glasgow in particular, I started working initially in the field of substance use, supporting people who had problem substance use. And I then fairly quickly moved into the field of working with HIV and sexual health. And in that particular field of work, working in charities, like the people I was in contact with, I just became, in contact with more queer folk. I was in contact with sexual health information that wasn't judgmental. Like we didn't even have a sex ed in school. We had a biology lesson that gave us the facts, and then we had a group come in and give us a drama about why abortion is murder. So it was a really, really difficult environment to get to know yourself, if your identities and your inner self. Because I think the irony is I know that I'm an incredibly open person, but I was so closed and so judgmental out of that place of fear until my early 20s. You know, like, it's kind of a bit of a joke sometimes now because I'm like, I was once conservative. I'm like, that is the opposite. Like, so, but it was for me, I'm not saying that that's everyone's experience, but for me, that wasn't congruent. That was a response to trying to put a black and white lens on the world because I couldn't understand myself. So I guess when I began to be able to accept the gray in the world and to deconstruct the fear that I felt and to start looking at myself not from a point of view of what's wrong with me and why am I not fitting in, and more how can I know me and allow me to be all of me. That's when I was able to see, oh, wait a second. Actually, all this other stuff that I've just been kind of getting on with, I've just been, going down the route of obligatory relationships or unquestioned assumptions about what constitutes a quality relationship. That's when I was able to kind of connect to that part of myself and was like, oh no, there's different ways of doing things. And relationship anarchy just fits that in a way that it's almost hard to imagine that I ever didn't know about it, if that makes sense. It's hard to imagine thinking about it in another way because it just feels so right. It makes it almost links my worldview on everything.
Well, and it sounds like you felt it, right? You felt it somewhere growing up. Like, I don't fit, but all you know to do then is be afraid and to feel like an outsider. If you don't fit with everybody else, that's a scary, right? The risk of not being part of a community, which your community then is everybody, right? That's terrifying. And now sounds like in college, your world view gets to expand and you get to start saying, oh, it's okay to be different. Like, there's other different, like, it's, wow. I appreciate you sharing, Jen.
Yeah. And I'm curious, do you have more on that point before I ask a different question? I just want to make sure.
No, that's okay.
I'm curious, you mentioned you have been in a long-term relationship with somebody that you live with, and obviously keeping their life journey private to them. I'm curious how the two of you have navigated this, because you've been together for a long time as you're going through this process of deconstructing all of that. And I imagine that also led into some conversations and things in your relationship as it shifted and evolved it over time. So I'd love to just, what has that experience been like for the two of you?
Yeah, I mean, it's been all the things. It's like that classic thing where it's been incredibly connecting and incredibly destabilizing at times. For him, during the time we've been together, that I've deconstructed so many parts of myself. And I think that that's a normal human thing, that we change and we shift and we're fluid and to varying extents and in different ways. But for him, the person that, who, when we met, although I think the essence of me was always in there, I am a different, like a more congruent version of myself now without all those kind of masks, I guess, that we have on to survive. So I guess for him, I think one of the biggest things was that he's a very open person. But where the challenge came was when I transitioned from personal therapy into doing personal therapy and training as a therapist, and I'm sure you might have this experience as well, but it essentially turbocharges your, like, your awareness of yourself, there's a way of relating to other humans and to yourself that you can't unknow. Like, you can't unself-aware yourself.
Yeah.
Everyone outside of you, like, I'll speak from my own experience, but I found that I was changing at such a rapid rate. And I was not only experiencing myself differently, but I was experiencing every single person in my life I was experiencing in a different way. And I think for him, probably out of anyone in my life, that was incredibly difficult, because he's just trying to keep up with my, all this change. Like, this person that he's known in one way for so long is now changing in multiple different ways. I'm like asking for my pronouns to be different. And like, I'm, I suppose I connecting to a queer community in a different way and that having a different meaning. And like, and then me to kind of rock up and be like, hey, I think I'm a relationship anarchist. It's like there is already so much change. And so I think we communicate it consistently throughout that. And I think one of the biggest, again, I think this is again why I'm not going to be too starstruck, but one of the tools that we used alongside the just intentional conversations is listening to your podcast separately and then coming back and talking about what we listened to and what it meant to us. And I think having those things that were outside of our relationship, outside of who we were, to almost ground our conversations in was incredibly helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Because there was points where I almost didn't know how I was changing. It was just happening so rapidly and so intensely that having kind of structures to guide our conversations and the multi-amory podcast and resources as well that allowed us to kind of almost bring it outside of ourselves, even though we were still reflecting on ourselves and what it meant for our relationships. It almost offered, okay, there's all these other ways of being. What do you feel about that? What do I feel about that? What would that look like for us? How does that? And I think that was important because it almost, for a little while, there was like this imbalance of like, he's just trying to keep up with this person that's changing. And I'm also trying to be known by a person who is not in the same situation, is not going through this turbocharged self-awareness journey. So yeah, it was hard. It was hard. There was hard moments where we had different languages for things. And I think because I go down the routes of, I will take in as much information as possible. I'm going to research everything. I'm going to get really into this and excited about this. And that is not his way of being when it comes to this. It also meant like I needed to be conscious of slowing down and he had to speed up. So we had to try and find a way to meet each other in the middle. And like in any relationship, that wasn't easy.
No.
But thankfully we got there.
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious to that point, as you start to, right, so coming to your partner and saying, hey, here's this new thing, I am relationship anarchist, right? That's one thing you have to do. But then there's what do you actually do with the information? And I'm curious, how did you two start to go from all of the, I don't want to say theory, but all of the internal work that you're doing to, okay, now we're going to like do it. Like we're going to start living the things that we feel. That's a whole other leap to make.
That's interesting because it is and it isn't. I think it was for him in a different way that it was for me, because as a queer person, I had already like connected with this found family. I'd already begun that process of being like, okay, what are queer platonic relationships and what do they look like in my life? And having this awareness of intimacy and what makes up intimacy, and how that I was experiencing intimacy with people that weren't my partner already in different ways. So I think for me, it was more acknowledging the varieties of intimacy I was already experiencing with people in my life and what they meant, and almost like understanding them within the framework of relationship anarchy. Because I think without the words, I was already experiencing relationships in that way. And for him, it was almost like an opening up of what could be, and then meeting new relationships that he was able to then come into with this new, I suppose, sense of just being allowed to experience them as they were or as they are. So it was a slightly, I guess, different process for both of us. For me, it was an acknowledgement of what I was already experiencing and then moving forward with meeting new relationships with that new understanding or that new framework. And for him, it was much more, okay, I can experience relationships in all these different ways, which for the identities that he holds is often like less common or less possible. It's like people are socialized in a certain way, and then it makes it more difficult to connect in these really depthful ways. So I think for him, it was exciting to be able to allow himself to develop these new relationships that felt like he could have needs that would be met that weren't just through like the dyad, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah.
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 It was a lot more. He it sounds like he had a lot less of the theory behind it, or in just his world. The pools he was swimming in had a lot less of that around. So he was still kind of pushing against the norms and within his own community. Versus you're surrounded by people who are kind of breaking all of the boundaries, and so you maybe had a little bit more reinforcement that's the people around you kind of got it a little bit more.
That is, yes, you totally put it. That is exactly it. And I think there was actually a really interesting challenge that came up with that. So because I was like, I'm experiencing myself in these new ways and telling my friends about it. And some of them were like, yeah, that like aligns with how I experience things, which I already knew to some extent. But like we now had this new kind of way of articulating it to each other. And but for him, he didn't have, other than the people the friends that he'd become close with as a result of our relationship, the people that he was connected to in his life, a lot of them absolutely did not have this frame of reference.
Yeah.
And so one of the challenges that came up for us was when we kind of came to our shared understanding, our shared way of articulating our relationship and what that meant. I didn't so much go through a process of revealing it to people because it didn't feel like a coming out situation. It didn't feel like that didn't feel necessary because it was already part of my world. But for him, you know, he shared that with some of his friends. And I remember feeling this overwhelming sense of fear of being judged. And this like overwhelming sense of like, oh, like I don't feel safe with this. Like I don't feel safe that was really difficult because for me, that was actually me inferring judgment on people. But it was because it was a trigger. It was a trigger for my past experiences of having witnessed judgment of diverse relationship styles, sexualities, gender identities. And so that came up for me as an experience of like, oh, I need to actually go process this myself, because you absolutely have the right to share your experience with the people who you care about. But I am at the same time feeling this sense of shame, this sense of like being really, really triggered. And I think that was, again, it was me, I suppose, inferring that judgment on people whose identities and experiences reflected the people I'd experienced that judgment with before.
Yeah.
So I think that's why, like, even so when I'm practicing with people as a therapist, like I really deeply, deeply feel that the best work you can do to fortify or nourish a relationship in a non-monogamous, whatever, I suppose, way you experience non-monogamy, is to work on yourself. Because you have to know when stuff come up for you, that you are aware of it, you're resourced enough to be like, actually, I'm going to process this. Some of this I can process with my partner or my partners. Some of it I need to process myself and kind of be accountable to that too. So it's like, I see it as kind of having a relationship of care with myself as much as other people. But it does just require a level of self-awareness to notice something and to be able to say, actually, this isn't on you and this isn't on your experience. This is something that's coming up for me because of my past experiences of judgment or my attachment wounds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
Yeah, I think it one of the things that sort of highlights for me is, and listeners of the show will know we're huge fans of finding and building community for yourself. But I feel like that really is when you're in a partnership and one of you has a community that sort of embraces the life you're trying to form, and one has a community that maybe doesn't as outwardly embrace it. Again, you kind of said like you were projecting maybe a lot of that judgment, but it seemed as if there was less support there. And then what that does, right, in the fear it triggers and the shame it triggers, and then it's the closing, the contracting of it. And so being able, because I think, the example we give is, right, if you go to your friend and you're like, oh, I'm really struggling because, my partner's out on a date and, I'm whatever the thing. And they're like, well, oh, well, there's your problem. I've solved your problem. You have a partner who's got a boyfriend or a partner who's got a girlfriend or whatever, versus them being able to just be like, oh, yeah, I totally get that. Like, maybe I don't have that experience, but like, I could see how that would be really hard. And like, let's talk about it. And so being able to have that community around you who gets it in a little bit different way is not that you have to like eliminate everybody else in your life, but if you can add that part in, it can really, I feel it can really like lift some of that shame and let you start to be you a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, it just adds depth, because I think the conversations that he was having, he was in a role of educator, and he was in a role of, okay, this is what this means, and fielding those doubts about what that meant for us.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, it was more like a queer joy. It was like, this is an amazing, so it was hard because that was the differing experiences we were having. And I think it's different now. We've got a really gorgeous community of people where I guess you get to share all parts of yourself. Like our experiences of intimacy is so much broader, and there isn't, like, he's not in that role of educating. And I mean, of course, like that comes up sometimes, but you don't mind that coming up sometimes. But I suppose it's hard when your first experiences of sharing your identity with people that you care about is met with fear, or like you in a position of judging or of educating. It maybe takes a little bit of that joy out of it. And that's just, I suppose, that's why now, as a therapist, I feel like it is important for us to talk about our experiences. Like I take that kind of anti-oppressive stance, that I don't feel like I'm not a person that's behind a screen who's wearing a suit and is not revealing any part of myself. I think it's important for us to have people that we can look to and be like, okay, maybe that's not exactly what my experience is, or what, but that it's somebody that I can see is maybe somebody like me, or there's some sense of what their journey was to get to the point that they're at, so that in those moments where you're sharing your experience, that maybe you've got something that you can give people, like, oh, listen to this thing, this is helpful. Takes that kind of burden off you as the person who's sharing it.
You can trust the person across from you that they really, I don't know, have lived some of what you're feeling. And I mean, of course, we can all, we can have empathy and compassion for people and their experiences, and we don't all have the same life experiences by any means. But when you can even, take a little piece of something and be like, no, that, like, I really get that part, like, because I've felt that too. It can just really deepen that connection.
Yeah. And like, again, it, like, the things that come up for people I'm working with are lack of understanding, people assuming that their whatever relationship structure they're in is invalid, or that they've got the biggest, I'm sure you'll both be aware, but like the big one being there's attachment issues, like there's something unhealthy, or there's something wrong, or there's something trying to be fixed. And like, I think as a therapist, for me, having clients to come in and just know that I'm not assuming their experience, I'm not, they're free to express and be who they are now, however that changes, whatever, like the space is theirs, but I don't have those judgments or those assumptions. So we're starting from a different place. I think what deepens my, I suppose, commitment to that is that experience of having witnessed when someone I love having to feel those same, I suppose, just isms, those assumptions, those little pieces of stigma and stereotyping that just kind of take the joy out of it, the joy out of just being a human and just expressing yourself and experiencing pleasure and play and all that with other humans and connecting.
I'm curious, Jen, is you as you and your partner started to take your sort of separate experiences in this, but then you're also at the same time walking on a path together. And I'm curious, how did the two of you then start to take now I'm stuck in the metaphor, but take the steps together of like, okay, maybe somebody's going to go out with something. Like these aren't maybe just platonic relationships, or maybe there's more ambiguity. Like I'm going out and I'm kind of interested, but I don't know what it's going to be. Like, how did you two start to sort of move in that direction to, I mean, I guess because where you're at today is you have multiple life partners, you have the partner that we've been talking about, you have other adventure partners, your ecosystem has expanded significantly. And I'm curious just like how you two started to like move towards some of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think one of the things we realized was that, and what I'm about to say, I will caveat it at this isn't necessarily something that everybody should or shouldn't experience, but we both have a kind of a natural, I suppose, connection to compersion, like a natural experiencing of it. Not that that means that we don't experience things like jealousy, that, they can both coexist. But I think that made it probably a little bit easier for us, because when we started to just go to, like, there's some really cool community spaces in Scotland. Like, it's definitely a growing community with lots of varying identities within that. When we started going to these community spaces, we started just enjoying experiencing each other, connecting with other people. And it was a very, that was like, I guess for me, that was a shock, because for so many years I had been so fearfully monogamous, because I fundamentally had this sense of if my partner experiences any form of intimacy with someone else, that, he's going to leave me because I'm not good enough. I mean, those are the feelings that I had until I started to work on myself and my kind of sense of self-worth. But when I had worked on that sense of self-worth and then worked on, like, okay, well, also that if, he can experience intimacy with somebody in the workplace, I'm not sitting there watching him the whole time. These things, there's like, I suppose, these boundaries that we put on spaces when coming from that place of fear that maybe actually don't reflect the reality of, like, humans connecting in lots of spaces. So when we went into these kind of community spaces, it was just a joy to see these different parts of each other, and then to come home and to, like, debrief and, like, have all these gorgeous conversations, and to feel like we were really living in a very present moment. And I think that process of taking very, very slowly. And that's what I would also say to, I think, go slow, talk about it to your therapist, to your partners, and then, because I think what comes from conversation can also be a lot of pleasure as well. There's a lot of fun, there's a lot of enjoyment, as well as the more difficult things. There's a lot of connection. And then each time just figure out how you feel and then come back and talk about it some more. I feel like that's been probably said 1,000 times, but, like, it is the case that talking about it is what makes it more enjoyable, and processing of the fear that comes with it. But just also, like, appreciating your partner as a whole person who, like, I don't feel the sense of needing to meet all of his needs, and he doesn't feel that sense of needing to meet all my needs, because you can't expect that of any other person. That just doesn't, and that's the kind of, I suppose, relationship anarchy, isn't it? Is that we're not expecting one person to be our whole world. We're, like, living in the reality that people meet different needs at different times. So I think witnessing that, processing it, trying it again, expanding it, and then, just checking in with each other. Yeah, I think I'm kind of rambling now, but
No.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate you summarizing in that way.
Yeah, because sometimes it takes me a little bit of time to get to the point I'm like, if I was editing a podcast, the summary is the bit that I'd be looking for.
No, I mean, I think it's amazing. And what I kind of took away from that was, even though you had different support systems, you had different speeds at which you were doing this. You're in turbocharge mode. When you landed in some of these spaces where the rubber kind of meets the road, you both sort of have a proclivity leaning into a little bit of the compersion, leaning into that. And so even though it might have been tough, you could both kind of tap into that sort of element to go through these experiences together and then come back out of them and say, how was that for you? Talk about it, and then go in and try another one, and then come out, and then slowly sort of building that snowball as you're like rolling down the hill a little bit more together at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious too, you mentioned that you grew up you did feel conservative because of all the reasons we discussed. You grew up in a fairly open family. And I'm just kind of curious how it's been going, all this transition has been with family and other people in your life that have known you that long.
Well, I should probably clarify my immediate family rather than my extended family.
There's a difference.
Different vibes. yeah. Very, very different vibes. So I think the thing is because my immediate family are so open that it's just like, well, this is a new part of you that we're learning about. There's almost a sense of like, I think that it's sometimes hard to take all the information in and like understand it. Certainly for my parents, my two sisters, it's just different because they're a bit younger. So I think they just kind of, their exposure to things is different. So they're very much like, okay, cool, that's fine. But I think for my parents, like as open as they are, then it's just also taking that information in and trying to be like, okay, well, what does this actually mean? And again, I think I'm very lucky because where my parents also emigrated. It's like a thing in Ireland. Everybody emigrates, then they come home, and then the next generation do it. It just happens over and over. My parents emigrated to Holland or the Netherlands, and I think their exposure to the world there and the kind of like a much more progressive culture, even though it was, like the 90s, maybe shaped their openness because they were, they were just meeting people from all walks of life that you just wouldn't come in contact with in rural Ireland. Maybe in like Dublin, even then, probably not. And so I think there's a lot to be said for contact theory with how open people are. But again, I think we're all kind of informed by the environments that we move through. So yeah, I think that's about probably as much as I can say on that.
No, I appreciate you sharing, and I agree. There is something to be said for sure about contact theory and like the openness of people, and the fact that your parents had maybe a different experience than some other people in the family inform some of that, and that all makes sense. Thank you for sharing.
I would love to talk a little bit more about sort of like how it looks today. You touched on like the overview of what your ecosystem is, but I think for people who first hear relationship anarchy, it's often the assumption is it's anarchy, it's chaos, just no rules. We're just going to go out and do whatever we want. No one's going to tell Jen what to do. And it sounds like your world is obviously more organized than that sort of picture I just painted. And you have the partner that we've been talking about, and then you said multiple life partners. And I'm curious how do you, like on the day-to-day or on a monthly basis, how do you balance time with each of them, plus time for yourself, plus time for your adventures, and all of the things you want to do in life? Like what do these look like on like a practical basis?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think it also highlights, I suppose, something that again I talk about both in my practice but also my personal life, which is like the privilege of time and energy. I am chronically ill. My health isn't always static. There's sometimes where I have no energy. There's sometimes where I have lots of energy. And I think that feeds into how my relationship ecosystem is. It's about, I have to be open about what the limitations are in terms of my time and my energy. And also the changes that come with that there's sometimes where I'm not as present because I'm not able to be as present. So I think it's very much about communicating when I'm unable to communicate, I think is a fundamental part of it for me. Because there's times where, I'm in regular contact with my life partners and obviously my partner who I live with, and our wider kind of community. But there's times where I just have to step back out of that, where my health I just don't have the spoons, if you're into kind of spoon theory.
Yes. Yeah.
But what makes that okay is not only the communication, but the practice of care that goes on a consistent basis. So I kind of meet every relationship that I'm at with a sense of non-judgment, a sense of I am there if this person needs me to be there, but they're also there for me. That we have this sense of you can rely on me. And if there's some way that is usually practical in terms of energy, I'm generally an emotionally available and dependable person, which you'll be glad to hear given I'm a therapist. But, there's I might not be always practically available for people, but I'll absolutely always be there emotionally. So I think that having those conversations about what is possible within the relationships is important. Just that it feels really basic, but being open with each other. I mean, I suppose it involves a certain level of being open with yourself as well. And maybe that's where the difficulty comes in, because it also involves accepting the times that I don't have the spoons to be a present person. And of course, I have to process my own experiences of feeling guilty about that and things like that. But that's just an ongoing experience that comes with being chronically ill and coping with the changes that kind of come with that. So yeah, I think all relationships is about being open, knowing that you're there for each other, even if it's not in every way, that it's in some ways. And I guess one of the things, and this is one of my life partners' therapist always used to say this to her, was about how do you kind of orient to pleasure? And I think that pleasure takes a lot of different forms. So I also think that there's something about intentionally engaging with pleasure with people within my relationship ecosystem. Because it's I suppose I've just focused there more on meeting some of our other needs, but there's also are we having new experiences together? Are we having, like you said earlier, adventure partners? Are we having adventures together? So I think there's something about also having the joy that comes with being a person, that it's not just limited with me and my partner that live together, but that we experience it more broadly than that too. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, no, it does to me. I mean, I think the piece that I often take away from these conversations is, right, the title of life partner, that might mean 100 different things to 100 different people. And so when you go into a connection with somebody and you say, hey, we're labeling our partnership as life partners. But then the next step is, well, what does that mean? What's the definition of that? And the fact that you could have two different life partners with two different definitions of what that means, what energy you have for that, and how that looks, right? And so it's really about like you said, the communication, getting clear on it, and then just being transparent about it. And that's hard sometimes when you don't even know. I don't even know necessarily how many spoons I have until I ran out. And then I realized I actually ran out 7 spoons ago. And now I'm running on a huge deficit, and I've got to maybe do some cleanup. Oh, I should have hurt 3 people and people. And then you adjust and have new conversations.
Yeah.
And it's just a constant iterative process of how can I be in a relationship or in relationship with any given person, whether it's romantic or sexual or not.
Yeah, I mean, the expectation setting is really important. Really, really important. But I also think that I think I perceive relationships as I think because I live away from Ireland. I mean, here is home as much as Ireland is home. But so I think I've always had this sense of like my relationships aren't just about our physical in person time. It's also about how we connect around that. Even if it's something that's like, here's this song that made me think of you or that I think you would love. I think there's ways that we can practice care in relationships that aren't necessarily, that can accommodate the differences in our energy, whether that's because in my case that I'm chronically ill, or in somebody else's case because they've got kids, or, you know, whatever it is, whatever your particular, I suppose, the constitution of your life is, or the makeup of your life is, there's something about being creative in how we practice care with each other and practice connecting with each other. And while I might only have one weekend free and I might end up having, you know, my health might be bad on that weekend, or I've caught a cold and I'm no longer available, it doesn't mean that I'm not also communicating my care with you in different ways. So I think that that's important as well, is that, yeah, just being creative with each other and also being open to those relationships, those ones that you meet and you're like, wow, we really connect. Like, I'm excited to experience where this is going to go. I think being open to that in your heart is a very exciting way to live life, because you just never know who you're going to meet and you might just really connect. And some people are in your life for a season, some people for longer. I think it's also being open to that. Like, people change, I change. As you can maybe tell, I very much live in this kind of gray area of it's all possible, but as long as we've got some values that are leading our practice of care to each other, then we can kind of be open to those changes.
Yeah. I love that. And communicate, right? Comes back to communication, that you keep on communicating, keep on checking in over time, and as things shift and change in each of your lives. Yeah, the importance of that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I would love for you to talk a little bit more about your work, if that feels good to you, and where people can find you.
Yeah, so I work online. Again, really accessible when you're chronically ill to have an online, makes it much more consistent. So I work with anyone who kind of is able to work on GMT, so like British time, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what's been really lovely about my work is that, so one of the challenges that I find in the kind of non-monogamous space personally is that there is just not a lot of awareness of particularly like ethical practices of care. That's not something that, because I mean, unless you're someone who goes on an info spiral like I do, you're not necessarily going to naturally come across these things. So I think what is lovely in my practice is, like, although I'm person-centered, is being able to share information with people, like offer resources to make like this big, sometimes this massive unknown. Even if somebody's practicing, say, for example, if they're poly for years or they're in an open relationship, I think there's no guarantee that they'll have had access or come in contact with the resources that can just help them work things out. So I think a big part of my practice with everyone I work with, but particularly with my non-monogamous clients, is just working with them for them to develop their sense of self, but also being able to offer resources, whether the ones I'm making myself or, you know, all the good stuff like Polysecure and like those more kind of accessible resources, is like giving people that sense of, okay, there's actually a lot of people experiencing themselves and their relationships and the relationship ecosystems in these ways. And like the challenges you're having, lots of people have them. There's ways to move through them. I guess it's a sense of that you're not alone in this. You know, it might feel that way sometimes, but just because the community is made invisible by a society that doesn't accept it, doesn't mean it's not there. And doesn't mean there's not these, mostly in the US, like a lot of really amazing, whether it's therapists or writers who are sharing really helpful information and hope for people. And I think it's really helpful having podcasts like yourself to share as well, because therapy is great, but therapy needs to come in alongside people having the opportunity to connect and find belonging. And I think having those resources allows that. So yeah, so I guess that's a bit about my practice. Where people can find me, I am on Instagram at psychotherapistjen, and my website is psychotherapistjen.com. I don't know how I was lucky enough to nab that on Instagram, but I did. So
That's awesome.
Here we are. Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking about your work and sharing how you approach things. I just really, really appreciate it. And for a reminder, anybody who's listening, you can find links to Jen's work in the show notes, so you don't have to remember how to spell everything as well. But on that note, do you have anything else that you would like to share, get out there in the world before we let you go?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, as I said, there's a fairly, it can feel like there's like a very small or an invisibilized community of non-monogamous people in Scotland, and I think in Ireland to a great extent. And I think what I would like to drive home is that there are other options that people, whether you identify as an identity or an orientation or practice, that there are lots of non-monogamous people out there. And if you do decide that that's something that you're going to explore, you will find connections. And there also are therapists out there, whether it's me or there are other therapists in the UK who won't judge you. Because I hear it way too many times, folk coming in and being like, I tried to talk about this with my therapist and they were like, well, have you tried being just in a relationship with one person? Or they've said something that has, I guess, they don't have the basic knowledge to let people explore themselves at depth. And I guess I would just reassure that there are places like, whether it's pink therapy or otherwise, that you can go and you can find that there are people out there who both have lived experience, but also professional experience to help you kind of explore that. So even if there's like a little part of you that thinks, oh, maybe, but it feels really frightening and I can't imagine what it would be like, and I've never seen anyone experience themselves in this way, even if it never comes to anything, find a space to explore it, because maybe it's just something that's kind of speaking to you that reflects who you really are.
Love that.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jen. I appreciate everything you shared just now and for the last hour or so that we've been talking. And so grateful that we connected on Instagram and that we got to make this happen. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I suppose have a lovely afternoon.
Yes, yes. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
We're back. Thank you so much, Jen, for coming on, sharing your story, and for all of the incredible work that you do as well. A quick reminder, go to your podcast show notes, either in your podcast player or on our website, normalizingnonmonogamy.com, and you can find links to all of Jen's work there.
Click on the podcast tab.
Yes.
You'll find links to all of Jen's work and links to all of our previous guests as well.
Yes.
Plus photos.
Yes. Those too.
Yes. All right. A quick reminder that in the middle of September, we have a retreat coming up. That is September 13th to the 15th. We will be in person here in the San Francisco Bay Area for all of our virtual community members. So now is the time, the best time, I think, to join the virtual community, because you get to be virtual and then you get to come right in person and meet about 50 to 60 amazing people from around the country. We'd love to have you join us.
Yes, we would. Go to our website, normalizingnonmonogamy.com, click on the community tab, and you can find out all of the information right there.
And we will see you out here in September.
Yes. And next week, we have another interview with May. Hopefully, I will not have laryngitis anymore. But regardless, it is a beautiful interview with May. Super fun.
I'm making a money-back guarantee that Emma will not have laryngitis. If she does, next week's podcast is free.
Yeah, right. Good job.
All right. We'll see everybody in a week.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for listening.